Today, I'd like to continue our journey through the book Undoing the Knots by Maureen O'Connell. A wonderful book about Maureen reflecting on her own roots and finding racism within her family. At this point in our journey, she quotes a wonderful theologian from the United States, Brian Massengill. Brian contends that white comfort sets the limits for the racial justice movement in the United States. When you unpack that a little bit, you can see the wisdom. What are we comfortable with talking about as white people in terms of racism? A lot of us, to be honest, aren't comfortable talking about the topic at all. It makes us feel a little bit anxious. We tend to say, well, this is something that's settled. Everybody treats everyone with respect. Everything is fine. There's really no racial problem. There's just some troublemakers who talk about it. People that are lazy, they have nothing else to talk about, and they see racism where there is no racism. And so, as white people engaging in a serious conversation about this topic is difficult. It's not something that we're used to doing when we get together with our friends, particularly if most of our friends are white. They kind of maybe reinforce what we think. It's hard for us to go and look at things from another perspective. But we frequently talk about wearing another person's shoes, walking in another person's shoes, looking at things from another person's point of view. And that sounds wonderful. It sounds great. But it's a challenge to do that because we are who we are. We're used to our own way of thinking. Change is difficult for us. We get used to a certain pattern of living, a certain structure of life. We have certain friends that we're comfortable with, certain topics that we're comfortable talking about. And it can be hard for us to enter into another person's experience. It can be a real challenge. And we can look at being white as the norm in the United States. We can say, well, the majority of people are white, and so everybody else has to kind of follow that majority. Majority rules, and white people have certain customs and privileges and way of being, and that's just the way it is. If you don't like it, you can go back to Africa, go to another country, and don't bother me about it. And so I think Brian Massengill observes a certain aspect of the conversation that is very true about us in the United States. White comfort does set the limits. What are we comfortable with? And the racial justice movement in the United States has had naturally its ups and downs. We can look back to the 1960s and the progress in civil rights and say that's great, that's wonderful. But we sometimes don't unpack it any further and say, well, what has happened since then? Are black and white people more integrated? Are they more equal? What are the statistics that show that or don't show that? Do we even want to look at that and talk about it? Again, what are we comfortable with can sometimes set the limits for the movement. Well, James Baldwin, the black author, wonderful writer, has a suggestion for us as white people. And the suggestion is to go as far back as you can and travel the road again. So in your own personal history, to go back in that history and unpack it. Go back as far as you can. What about your parents? What was their experience like in terms of racism? What about your grandparents, your great-grandparents? country of origin, their experience, and to travel that road. And as you travel that road, to tell the truth. And this is not easy by any means. Most of us would say, well, why do I have to go back into my past? I have to live in the present. And of course, we do have to live in the present. It's important to live in the present. But can we live in the present totally, adequately, accurately, without knowing where we've come from? Particularly in terms of racism. Baldwin would say, no, it's not going to happen for you. If you don't, unpack that past a bit, it's just going to be the same old, and you're not going to look at the depths of racism. And the term for that process is reckoning. We need to reckon with our own past in terms of our own background, in terms of this topic of racism. So let's reckon with that. Well, let's not be afraid to do that. I mean, it's not going to destroy us. It's not going to harm us. Telling the truth really only helps us, doesn't it? The truth liberates us. And in that liberation, we can enter more fully into the present, which is the reality, of course, that we must be engaged in and with and live in. And when you look at part of the reckoning, and you look at Catholicism in America, Maureen says, well, the first thing you must look at is the whiteness of it. And a lot of times we don't think about it. We just accept it, that, well, that's the way it is. Well, let's ask a question about that. Why is Catholicism so white? Is it that Black people don't find it challenging, don't find it enjoyable, don't find Christ in Catholicism? Well, in a way, when you look at it, that should upset us, shouldn't it? I mean, isn't our religion for everyone of all colors and persuasions? And the fact that a number of people are not attracted to Catholicism, particularly Black people, the fact that most of our congregations in many areas are purely white, that might raise some questions for us. And say, well, why is that so? Isn't our religion a very vibrant and engaged, wonderful religion that we want to share with everyone? And the reality is that in many parts of the world, Catholicism is very Black, is very brown. But in America, which has a lot of Black and brown people, in many areas it's purely white. So Maureen says, well, let's take a look at that. Let's examine the why of that. As we get into the book and the reflections a little further, we will take a look at that and explore that.